Hello everybody, we are Susana Marron Gonzalez and Agata Zelachowska from the University of Salamanca, and we are really pleased to be here presented at the SFLIG conference our current research, Multimodal Metaphors of Migration in Judy Morales' children's picture book, Dreamers, A Migrant's Perspective. Here's the outline that we will follow for our presentation. To start with, we'd like to explain why we were interested in this object of study. And the first reason is that today's society is witnessing a global migration crisis in different parts of the world, as we can see from the recent events about the Syrian and Afghan refugees or the Latin American migration in the United States. The way migration is construed multimodally and metaphorically is of great interest in discourse analysis, and more particularly in the press, since it is a great information source for exploring this complex topic. As we will see, migrants are represented from the host country's perspective in this genre, and it is aimed mainly at an adult audience. Another reason is that educational institutions should address this topic. We deem essential to integrate multimodal literacy practices in the curriculum, not only from an outsider's perspective, but also from the migrants' one. Children's picture book can be exploited for its value as meaning-making resources that can be targeted at young readers from early childhood, so that they can grow up and become active agents and challenge social injustice. Now, my colleague will provide you with an overview of the existing representations of migrations in the media.
Studies that have been carried out so far point out to the overwhelming number of negative metaphorical representations of migration and migrants in discourse, especially in the press, which present the host country's point of view, and they depict migrants as the threatening others, for instance, as natural disasters. They refer to migrants as waves, floods, or deluge, migrants as animals, parasites or swarms, for instance, unwanted plants or weeds that need to be uprooted or weeded out. Migration is very often conceptualized as a military conflict and migrants as invaders, for instance, armies or conquering hordes. Migrants are very often objectified in the media, and they are referred to as objects or commodities or goods that can be redistributed, for instance. Among the studies, many have focused on the representation of Mexican and Latino population in the US. And the metaphorical constructions of migrants from this part of the world do not differ from the common widely used metaphors in public discourse worldwide. So, for instance, migrants are also depicted as animals, as a natural disaster, as invaders, diseases, or burden, and also as criminals metonymically, as demonstrated by Catalan law in 2013. They are depicted as criminals most of the time. Catalana in 2017 again proved the prevailing metaphor, immigrants are dangerous waters. Specifically, she did some research on immigrant children who are also portrayed as dangerous waters, and she also explored the implications of this dominant portrayal on the education of immigrant children in a community. Catalana and Mitchell-McCullough in 2019 looked into the metaphorical and metonymical multimodal depiction of migration of accompanied migrant children to the US. Not only in the discourse of the media, but also in the children's own discourse, their own accounts of migration. And the differences between the media and the children's use of verbal metaphors were considerable. Migrant children are water, so pouring into the United States or streaming over the border, and migrant children are animals, rounding them up or corralling them, were again prevailing in the media discourse. However, in the young newcomers' accounts, water metaphors were absent, and the most frequently occurring metaphor was migration is a journey, described as a journey from home, so in which country of origin is conceptualized as home, a journey of hope, of life, of better opportunities. It was also conceptualized as a dangerous journey in which migrant children may become prey to gangs or border patrol. So migrant children also referred to themselves as animals, as prey more specifically. Feng and O'Halloran, quoting Morris, state that metaphors serve the purpose of understanding through domestication, a process in which abstract ideas and unfamiliar persons or events are converted into something close, familiar, and concrete, which is very very important to point out, talking about children's picture books. So an abstract complex concept such as migration is made more familiar and closer to them, as represented through metaphors, as we'll see later on. LRFI also adds that abstract meaning needs to be resourced visually by means of symbols, metonymies, or metaphors. This is the case of the abstract concept of migration, and whose metaphorical representation in Dreamers is the subject of our analysis as an illustration of contemporary children's literature.
Let's now introduce the author, Judy Morales. She is a Mexican writer and illustrator. In fact, this picture book is an extraordinary example of the artistic skills, not only in writing but also in crafting. For example, we can see different cultural elements of Mexico on the book, like patchwork and drawings and materials, and on the other hand, she gives an account of her and her son's personal experience as migrants in the US. For this reason, it has been several times awarded in books competitions. And as we mentioned earlier, children's picture books are a powerful multimodal artifact. So they're texts that help in literacy development, not only on the reading skills. For example, authors like Katorsky, Moses, Serafin, and Holtin claim that children should understand and interpret meanings that are other than the textual or the verbal, that is the written text. And for example, the visual modes. So learners need to negotiate these meanings when the modes are intertwined and convey these meanings. And secondly, this is a literary genre that mirrors shared cultural values, attitudes, and skills. And of course, migration is an encounter between two cultures. And tackling this issue helps in the development of the intercultural communicative competence, especially in foreign language teaching and learning, as Byram claimed, and finally leading to intercultural awareness and promoting social justice values. And finally, it triggers the child's socialization, and the children at these very early stages of life, they are guided by the teachers to understand the world that they live in.
So our study builds on a multimodal and multidimensional approach in order to engage in a multimodal analysis of dreamers and track multimodal metaphors of migration. The previous literature review served as the starting point for the formulation of the following research questions, namely, what elements of transitivity are employed verbally and visually to construe migration, and what conceptual metaphors are present in the multimodal construction of migration and migrants. For the analysis of image-text relations, and an analysis of transitivity patterns and the semiotic choices was conducted to determine the representation of migration and taking into consideration the migrant's perspective. Firstly, we examined the verbal and the visual representational meaning. And drawing upon systemic functional grammar, we identified the configuration of the clause in terms of experiential processes, participant roles, and circumstances, and provided a quantitative analysis of the frequency of their appearance. On the other hand, images were analyzed experientially following the visual social semiotics framework developed by Crescent van Leeuwen. And more completely, we analyzed it also following the elaborated version for reading visual narratives in children's picture books, adapted by Painter, Martin, and Answorth, later on Moya Guijarro, and Cañamares Torrijos. Secondly, multimodal metaphors of migration were identified following a joint framework of multimodal conceptual metaphor theory and social semiotic approach to the visual representation of metaphor. Finally, the intertwining of the verbal and visual modes was triangulated with the multimodal metaphors of migration identified. And since migration is an encounter of cultures, we have also considered intercultural education with special attention to the concept of intercultural communicative competence, first developed by Byram. The qualitative analysis facilitated understanding of the migration experience instantiated multimodally in the picture book. The adoption of the mixed methods approach, we think, provides a better understanding of our research in that it enables us to integrate qualitative and quantitative results, to shed light on the meaning-making resources deployed in the representation of migration as a social construct, and to communicate this event to young readers from a unique migrant perspective. Well, as for the results, the main underlying multimodal metaphor turned out to be migration as a journey. So also the metaphor that appeared in children's own discourse in Catalan and McCullough 2019 research on the discourse of migrants themselves. It is a very productive metaphor, and several metaphorical mappings were used, and a lot of metaphorical entailments as well. There are 32 metaphors in total, 12 of which are cued only in the visual mode and 20 of which in the verbal-visual mode. In the table below, we can see some of the examples of metaphors cued in the visual mode only and in the verbal-visual mode as well.
On the other hand, we have concentrated on the analysis of representational meaning, both visually and verbally, and this has led us to state that migrants are active agents in the narrative. We will look at the transitivity patterns that are present at clause level and also in the visual mode to understand the configuration of participant roles, processes, and circumstances. If we have a look at the charts below, we see that the main processes are relational and relational attributive, because we can see all the attributes that the protagonists have as identification of their culture, their home culture. Secondly, we have many instances of material processes, and specifically material transformative, which also is an example of their agency, as we will see. And in the third place, we find the mental processes, both perceptive and cognitive, because we can dive into the character's mind and consciousness as they discover a new language and a new culture. And this entails that they have changing qualities throughout the process. Now we will address the multimodal metaphor. Migration is a journey. As in the different stages, it appears multimodally. So we can see the pre-departure point when they are leaving the home country. Then another stage is the arrival in the foreign country with feelings of amazement and fear, and also moments of adjustment to the target culture where they are making mistakes because they are not familiarized with the cultural norms of the US. Also, this leads to another stage, which is the adaptation to the cultural practices and behaviors, but at the same time, they recognize the value of their home or native identity. And finally, we see that gradually they are integrated in the target community. Their stories, their two languages, and they are dreamers, soñadores of the world. So this code switching also implies that they are integrating in the country.
We have selected two double spreads to illustrate specific stages of the migration journey to get an insight of the multimodal construction of migrants' identity and their agency. In the third double spread, which is the one on your left at the moment, the reader can see a backpack full of gifts. In the visual mode, the gifts are symbolic attributes, that is, objects that conventionally represent Mexico, such as the guitar, the dog, the volcano, the milagrito, which is a common Mexican handcrafted charm, the toy skeleton associated with El Día de la Muerte, so the day of death, the moon, the star, and other meteorological elements like the sun, the clouds, etc., the green leaf and the flower. A recurrent element in the book is the pencil that you can see sticking out of the backpack, which symbolizes the author's love for drawing and highlights her role as actor in the material creative process of writing her migration story. In the verbal mode, these gifts are the goal of the material transformative process bundled, in which the mother and the child, we are actors. The place circumstantial element, the backpack, holds the symbolic attributes together along all the journey. Noteworthy, the choice of noun gifts cues the conceptual metaphor migrant cultural contribution is a gift to the host country. In the subsequent double spread, so the one that you can see on your right at the moment, the reader can see the mother and the child presented as one figure of doing, crossing the bridge with their eyes closed, as if they were dreaming. The verbal mode and cross the bridge outstretched like the universe accompanying the picture indicates that they are still the actors in a material process. The bridge, which is the scope, clearly visually emphasizes the path that they are following as travelers, as walkers, which in turn cues the metaphor migrants are dreaming travelers. The characters embark on this journey one day, which is a nominal group functioning as location, time, circumstance, and are accompanied by flying monarch butterflies and swallows. These animals are known for their migratory patterns and making their annual journey from Mexico to the United States to breed. They also function as symbolic attributes here, cueing the metaphor swallows and monarch butterflies are fellow travelers. Therefore, animals are migrants too. The simile between the protagonist's lives and those of and the life of those winged creatures is constantly present in the narrative. An example can also be found in the 12th double spread.
And now we'll analyze the second double spread, which is the 12th one, because of their value as a stop in the journey and revealing one after discovering the library. So in comparisons with previous double spreads, we see that these cultural gifts are brought to life. They are living things. And why? Because they become actors of material transformative processes like walking, flying, or carrying books. Also, they're travel companions. They have a supportive role. For example, they're carrying the books that do not fit in the mother's backpack, and they are also pointing the direction in the journey, as we can see in the recto with the milagrito. Something we should highlight is that during the narration, the participants are mainly the protagonists, but then books become co-participants because their careers in the relational attributive process of becoming, which again implies their changing qualities of migrants that are product of the intercultural experiences, or the third place as Cramsh explained, and their attributes are introduced by the possessive pronoun our. So this indicates the simile between the book's life and the migrants' one. And if we go more in detail with the multimodal metaphors, we will see differences. So in the first one, books are migrants' language, which visually is a mental perceptive process to point out the emotions recalled by the native culture through the senses. We consider touching and sensing the leaf and the house, and also the verbal mode when they say that they learn. So this is a mental cognitive process indicating the literacy moment as an enriching state and inevitable, which also empowers migrants. The second metaphor is books are migrants' home, as we can see also in the visual mode, with the hand superimposed on the main facade of the house and the child's hand illuminating the path to the house. And finally, we can see that books are migrants' lives, also in the visual mode, where material, mental, and behavioral processes indicate that books are the experience of being alive, so a window and a separation between the inner and the outer world, and a way of living as migrants. So through the stories, it is a journey, and also they are dreamers. We can see that this is a coping mechanism of children to avoid suffering and avoid the obstacles.
This study aimed at exploring the semiotic resources of the system of transitivity that are present in Dreamers, in this children's picture book, and that construe multimodal metaphors of migration. While mostly the visual and verbal modes complement each other to provide young readers with a first-hand account of the experience of migration in a welcoming but still challenging social environment. The results showed that migration is construed primarily through relational attributive processes, and secondly through material processes. The identity of the protagonists as migrants is variable as they go along the intercultural journey, and this allows them to discover their new identity. Simultaneously, migrants are acknowledged by the author herself to be an asset to the target society, thanks to their native language and multiple cultural practices, such as drawing or sewing, for instance, products that they make, mainly books, and their personal stories and perspectives, so feelings of gratitude, trust, Lutherfied, and resilience. This is revealed through the metaphor migrant culture contribution, represented by symbolic attributes is a gift to the host country. I think this is the best indication of it. On the other hand, their own agency in the building of their identity and in an indication in the host country. Migration symbolism as a personal story is encoded in semiotic choices that imply a mechanism of social acceptance as represented experientially and bimodally. Migrants, as the characters urge, are humans worth listening to instead of being objectified, as it very often happens in the media discourse of migration.
And here we show you the references we have used. And this brings us to the end of our presentation. So thank you for your attention. We'll be glad to answer any question in the Q&A session.